language research. Okay? Well, I would like to say some ideas, not ideas, but what happens with Aymara language. Aymara language, I don't like to say indigenous languages because that's a different class. Yeah. Just Aymara language is spoken in Peru, Chile, Peru. Three languages, Bolivia, yes. And first of all, the first grammar was written in 1603 by Ludovico Bertoni, he was Jesuit. Well, Aymara is a suffixing language. The suffixing language, you have one word, see? One word. Arus kita sipanya nakasa kipo niratis power. It's one word. That means we should communicate because we are human beings. What has a human being? Has a language. That language for communication. That means that that word, just the suffixing language, or have the root aru. In case of aru means arunya. In infinitive, which arunya is to speak. Aru is word, dictionary is different meanings. And arus kita sebenarnya kasi people like this person word, you see, that can be used in political speech. Yeah. Well, Saussure says I was trying to find habla in la lengua, it says Saussure, but I'm not finding those words in Aymara, or just aru means children here. It's not the very shapes. And we have the personal knowledge is important for direct communication. El conocimiento personal directo es one thing. Conocimiento indirecto es one thing. Important, yes, indirect knowledge. For example, Padre Nuestro, you know, Padre Nuestro, Padre Nuestro was translated with, we have two pronouns, we. One exclusive and one inclusive. And that was translated into with inclusive word. Para Dios de nosotros, no de ustedes. I remember I was in Miami, we had some meeting there, and I wrote some small paper. I said, maybe there is some mistake here. Some American linguist stand up and says, quiere decir means Dios de los blancos, no de los indios. You know? You can translate that. That was the translation for that American linguist. And not important thing for us is human, not human. We have to differentiate. But if you say, for example, in English I heard say, for example, dog is he, here, in English. People is here. That is human, not human. I might not say that. But I remember one friend of mine in Miami, well, in America, he said, Juan, I would like to introduce you to Mr. Brown. I was expecting Mr. Brown, I didn't realize that time. And she came in with his big dog, and she was a dog, and her the dog. And she said, this is Mr. Brown. Yeah? That is for realizing how it works, you see? Different languages. But I cannot say, also, this is such a thing. I cannot say in Aymara this when the person is here, close to me. No, this is an insult for people. Maybe when the person is far away. That's important there. And on that point, I would like to say, and it's important animate and not animate things, for example. We have two verbs for that. Saña is to say, and caña is one. If animal and human say, siu, he said. Dog said something and people said, it's all right. Siu, siu. When it's inanimated, say tiu. But because we don't have that sound, that word sound in Aymara. We cannot find the word sound. Sonido, we cannot find in Aymara. The case, it depends. If I said sok, sound, or somebody knock the door, toc, 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 tiu. I cannot say toc, toc, sil, because that door doesn't speak. Those are the differences too. And another would be Sanya, human, and Aro, I would like to say again. Arunya means to speak. And Aro, originally first was used Sanya to say. But after it changed to Parlanya, or like Latin or Italian, parlare, and it changed. But that word, the root was applied for hen, by Waiparo, the hen's song, Waiparo. It changed.
The cry of the chicken.
The chicken, but it's Waiparo, the one was hen, and the other is a different say, Waiparo means that. And maybe that's why they changed the root of this word. But the aro means that we have suffixes, many suffixes. Each suffix morphologically means something. See, that is because it can be spelled. That word, see? And I remember some phrases like thank you, thank you, thank you. Cannot find in Aymara, thank you. I met a student, American student, he has to write one paper, and he said, I'm looking for thank you. How do you say thank you in your language? Thank you, I don't have that in that case. But we have the word walitiu. Walitiu means thank you, thank you. It's not really thank you, it's walitiu, that's all right. The thank you is inside that word, see? And you can read this one. And, you know, now I'm borrowing words. For example, we talk about revitalización de la lengua. It's just a revitalizar, well, I read books and books about that. But the person who teaches bilingual, I think that the person who teaches that has to know the grammar, everything. You see, the first language, all are the same. But in case of Spanish, I have to know Spanish, grammar Spanish, gramática española I have to know. Also gramática Aymara, what I can compare. That after that I can talk about bilingual education, but they can always separate, not mixed. Now, for me, well, I had some, sometimes I used to say in order to revitalizar, which I say, each language has their own role, their own norm, this one. And Aymara has their own norm, but it cannot be the same. Well, that will be maybe that we can teach in escuelas normales, they can start. But who can teach now? That's the way it cannot work because only lingual without. If I don't know French, for example, I cannot be to stay among the French people saying I have teaching bilingual education. I don't know French. That failed, I can say I failed education bilingual. This was one. And also, well, otra frase que es importante para mí, it's important for me, that is language reflects the culture. Eso dicen los estudiosos. Porque sin la lengua, ¿de qué podemos hablar? No separamos lengua y cultura, porque al final de cuentas, la lengua refleja la cultura. Sin hablar la lengua, por eso que los estudiosos primero estudian, first the researchers, they study the first language. For example, I remember that Navarre, for example, he wrote about Aymara, he wrote about Aymara in the 1940s, and he learned first Aymara. He wrote tales, stories, everything in Aymara. But nowadays different, you see. But somebody goes to, he has 2 tapes or 1 tape, that's enough for write something. See? Es importante. Entonces, we can realize that all languages are complex. There's no any language, it's an easy language, no, it's not. But we have to realize those things. Also, and at the school, I think the professor who teaches, he has to know how to stand up, how to talk. Antes se dice que la retórica era tan importante, antes la oratoria era muy importante. Entonces, sí, la oratoria era, exacto, ¿no? Y la retórica, después la forma, la gramática del cuerpo era importante en aquellos años. Y actualmente ya no hay nada de eso, sino que uno entra a una clase y no tiene forma, y entonces tiene importancia. Entonces son cosas, tal vez algunas preguntas yo creo contestar.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Juan. That was exactly 10 minutes. Very good, very good. But is there anyone who'd like to ask us any clarification or any comment you'd like to make?
Yeah, I found very interesting this last comment about the actions of poetry and rhetoric, because it really connects with that representation, connection, like creation that I was talking about. So this is like eliminating the tale of creation and interaction, just enhancing representation, no? Which is like language and informative as an information language, with no attention for the connection of language and the creation of poetry.
Do we have an idea when, do we know when the Aymara word to speak, Ararunya, changed to Parlanya?
Yes.
Because Parla is, I think it's an archaic Spanish word.
Latin.
Well, it's Latin originally, but I think it was also used in Old Spanish.
Yeah, French Catalan is one.
Colonial Spanish, yeah.
Sí, sí.
So was it in colonial times that Aru got displaced by Parla? Do we know that?
If you look at both Germans,
Oh, yes. Because it's an interesting one, isn't it? That Aru is retained for language of animals, the sounds that animals make, but Parla is for humans. And then in sorry.
Y otro aspecto que se caracteriza con Aymara Language, debe ser igual en quechua y demás, ¿no? La nominalización y verbalización. O sea que los nominales se vuelven verbos, los verbos se vuelven nominales. ¿No? Es importante, Denise va a hablar sobre esto. Es importante esta cuestión de las diferenciaciones, ¿no? El uso, todo eso, ¿no? Entonces, I think that maybe we can start teaching something at the escuela normal or something a los maestros.
Okay, we'll stop you there. But what I think is really interesting about Juan's presentation, if you don't mind me just commenting a little bit, because I asked him, would you tell us something about Aymara ideas about language? And he did, but he also told us about the Aymara language. And so that's a very interesting kind of combination there. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Like a final research paper, like most of you have been presenting today, it was quite spontaneously prompted by the call circulated by Rosalind, because actually it resonated quite in my own experience as a former director of an international organization, non-governmental organization for linguistic diversity called LinguaPax in Barcelona. And also resonates with some connections I can make with my current research in the University of Europe. So I will be therefore presenting more or less raw reflections and ideas that actually will be redundant with many of the ideas that we've been like commenting on today. And also I have to say that the title might be a bit misleading because it could be actually the whole focus of the thing, but it could be like one of the parts. So the fact that applied linguistics remain in good measure and theoretical linguistics impermeable to the advances in critical research is also true when it comes to the international agenda for linguistic diversity. Diversity, I know it's also a very controversial concept that has been deconstructed during the whole day anyway. So in this regard, we can see how Western-based international organizations rarely let themselves be transformed by the understanding of alternative linguistic ideologies that are often part of their very networks and advisory boards. This is later from my abstract. And this is actually the first idea I had when I came across the call, because it's something that was very much with me since I was working in this context of international organizations. So being witness to this kind of wonderful plurality of voices across the board, of people coming from very very informative insights from sociolinguistics in India or in Malaysia or in Africa, Latin America, of course, where it's not just a matter of different natures of language, but concepts of what is for every community, what comes for their language to be revitalized. And this connects actually with I remember your name, like we're suggesting about multi-natured revitalization. So it's like, after this first exportation of colonial languages, that is probably mainly the focus of what we're discussing today, it was very obvious for me and some of my colleagues, of course, that there was also the case for exportation of sociolinguistics, of language policy approaches, and of course, like concepts of revitalization. So, and especially in the case of the context of these organizations, European-based, in particular this case was in Catalonia, and in Catalonia, as you know, there is a high level, let's say, of meta-sociolinguistic awareness. I mean, some say that every Catalan-born is a kind of born sociolinguist, because it's kind of meta-linguistic awareness. And with that, there is the flip side. Like there is like a very determined approach to language, which is like very univocally linked to identity, and this is something like a topic that we've been discussing here. And of course, this is not always the case, but at times there is reluctance to acknowledge that it is not always the case. So it's like, besides, okay, as a kind of minority language in Europe, we're just struggling against these big colonial languages for many reasons, but in the process, we're just introducing our own sociolinguistic approaches. It's usual that those organizations formally including plural voices, coming from very different linguistic ontologies and communication cultures, and ethoi, and I'm also very much reminded today of Rahman Hubchandani, who was, actually Rosalind Howard was part of this advisory board in Linguistic, so in Rahman Hubchandani. Yeah. Are heard, yes, out of politeness, but are left there as poetic appendixes because they have no actual consequence and they have no true transformational value in the further approaches of the organizations. Similar to what happens in a general social level in multicultural whole society, as Joel Robbins so well puts it in this quotation you have here from his article, "What is Nothing But Talk." If you know his work, you'll be guessing that he's talking here about the Urabnin in Guinea. So in these self-consciously multicultural globalizing times, reports on cultural difference do little to disrupt our own sets of understandings. Canons of appreciation are in place that at once respect these differences, and in doing so, dull any critical edge they may have. So we see how in many cases, even if bottom-up strategies are on paper as a requisite for good practice matters, international agendas are designed paying little attention to what counts as communicative practices and ecologies for the communities themselves. We may even think in cases where there is no notion of language at all, as I think Jan David Hauk pointed out in the case of the Acho in Paraguay, which was like a very interesting case, and it's really fitting very much into these reflections. So there is a fossilized assumption concerning the bounded nature of language, certainly, and its consequences, quantification and naming, and also about referentiality and its extreme caricaturesque consequences, such as languages as codes, post-vernacular emblems, identity emblems, marketed brands, etc. So those are like concepts that we have heard so many things here. Just kind of this will be like a kind of wrapping up all those things. But it's true that so many revitalization processes just end up in constructing these identity emblems that just put these cultures in the market. And also in many cases, languages become just codes. I remember this quotation by the Wyandot in North America of this culture that said, okay, we are revitalizing our language, but it's just to think the thoughts of the others. This is not a channel for our thoughts, but this is like putting the thoughts of our kind of the host community in this kind of native kind of aesthetic codification. So besides this, there is also other crucial claims that do not make it either to the applied domain, such as the interaction as the crucible for language use and change, and the protoesthetic dimension of communication, which is also like actually a crucial topic that sounds like peripheral, but is in the heart of many experiences of language. And of those of you working in verbal arts, actually, I guess that you have realized how this protoesthetic dimension of communication is not just this kind of derived experience of language, but it really takes part of the current grammatical formation. So it is against this well-known background that two actions were promoted in 2018 in the context of this organization. I worked in Barcelona. Both were like the organization of a residency, including verbal arts and critical linguistic agents and researchers, hosted by the residency Faber in Olot, Girona, and a series of seminars on language and spiritual traditions in 2 editions in 2017 and 2018, as we will see later. So they were basically designed as a response to these acknowledgements that I was describing previously, like to kind of raise awareness, not just of these kind of catalogs of linguistic diversity that had been promoted in Barcelona for 2 decades. Actually, the city was very good at doing that, and there was like museums for linguistic diversity, and there was a lot of exhibition of all the languages in the city, but there was not much awareness beyond that. So since there was a place so much committed to the linguistic diversity in the world, we considered it would be actually useful to broaden the scope of what are entailed in the concept of language, which goes beyond these codes that we just translate into structures and ethnic kind of simplifications. So a lot of work on pedagogy based, of course, again on the conventional construct of languages as objects. That was like the counter, the basis that we wanted to counteract on the so-called the standard average European linguistic ideology, like Alan Rossi calls it. Yes. So this was the realization was that this construct that we were like counteracting was increasingly inadequate in the changing communication cultures in highly diverse societies, as we have seen earlier in the presentation of Angela, Chris, and Angela Blackridge. And inadequacy, which is probably not just bringing to the fore the crisis of this European linguistic ideology, but in parallel, a crisis of the related concept of the person, understood as individual discrete units, as languages are. So also there is this deep connection that has been like mentioned like, at some moments in the day here between linguistic conceptualization and personhood and the self, intersubjectivity, which is basically like very much at the core of these reflections, and probably the connections are deeper and have even to be more fleshed out. So two signs that this crisis of our current experience of language goes parallel to a crisis with the concept of the person. Probably we can just think of two sides. In the first place, a compulsion towards, sorry for my lousy pronunciations in many words, I just hope most is understood at times I pronounce poorly. A compulsion towards the affordances related to enhanced intersubjectivity. We can think like in the digital context or the electronic media that provide for this affordance of intensify our experience of intersubjectivity, and in the process to question our old assumptions about individual bodies, not powers, called persons. And in the second place, the fact that the referential approach to language proceeds in favor of token interaction as the driver of language, in what some call the interactional term. In effect, as it is highlighted more and more in current research, language is being rediscovered as a real-time phenomenon of interactional creativity. It actually can be considered a rediscovery into, entre comillas, brackets, because the notion that language is a real-time phenomenon of interactional creativity lies at the heart of tradition of many so-called traditional linguistic ideologies, such as those also informing verbal arts or spiritual traditions. So it's not such a rediscovery, after all, if we consider the importance of the approaches based in talking interaction, such as interactional linguistics and so many other sociolinguistics approaches. So, according to them, there would be a sort of interactional validity. We could start thinking of a sort of interactional validity in our linguistic constructs based on this appreciation. So here there is the emphasis on the important fact that many of the well-established methodologies used across disciplines dealing with social and cultural aspects of language were developed when reference-centered views of language, so structuralist and generative, were still dominant. That was also the case for mainstream approaches to language policy theory and practice, and also, of course, the case for most international agendas on linguistic preservation and revitalization, and I was mentioning. So our views should address the critically changing relation of humans to language and communication. It is in the context of an expansion of epistemological and experiential repertoires that language has been rediscovered as a real-time phenomenon of creativity, challenging in the process not only the reference-centered approach and the code-centered caricatures of language, but also mainstream approaches to subjectivity and person boundaries. In relation to the notions of intersubjectivity and the person, I know it's been very abstract so far, but as I said, it was like spontaneously prompted, and there's a lot of reflections that I will relate at the end to the two specific events. In relation to the notions of intersubjectivity and the person, I would like to make a brief comment that relates closer to actually my current research. So it can be seen like an extravagant aside from our point, but it very much relates to the development of our notions of personhood, actually, that challenge our mainstream official notions of personhood. So across a range of disciplines, researchers have noted moments of everyday social life in which, although many times fleetingly, there seems to be dissolution of the boundary between self and other. They have been noted not only in the context of what is labeled as mystical or religious experiences, but in the context of everyday interconnectedness between humans. In the human social sciences, those enhanced manifestations of intersubjectivity are discussed in relation to ideas of, according to different authors, we have like a panoply of different terminologies and approaches from different disciplines. So we find embodied intersubjectivity, interpersonal resonance, interpersonal fields, the transmission of affect, and the porousness and permeability of the physical body. And in the psychoanalytical literature, there are references to moments of intense relational contact and connectedness within the therapeutic relationship, for instance, boundaryless affective states, etc., etc. So these are attempts to understand connectedness and reflect a range of disciplinary concerns that may seem very alien to what our concerns are here. They challenge, though, our conventional notions about the person and the self, individually bounded, and on which our notions of communication are ultimately based. So many of our communication constructs are based on individual bodies that are related to each other, and from our communication constructs come languages. So probably it's in these realizations that are coming from different sources, and that are actually like not alien at all to many of the experiences that you have every day with the languages you're working with. So of course your speakers are very much used to these kind of experiences of connection with the other and social concepts of personhood. But in our case, probably we are unlearning our own constructs and just rediscovering these things through very sophisticated labels and notions that are probably... So we could say that those marginal experiences of the self, exiled from the mainstream ideologies of communication and the person, dwell in the West in peripheral areas as excluded knowledge, such as theology, clinical experiences, or paranormal phenomena. So some would think like, okay, we can, some telepathic experiences, many would have, can be like described technically through one of those one of those phenomena. So those features, language as real-time phenomenon of interaction and creativity, and the experience of the porous interpersonal boundaries, are present in some of these alternative natures of language and practice. I'm just trying to make it shorter, and probably it's going to be incorrect. So I'm thinking here therefore of what is perceived in mainstream linguistic and policy context as peripheral, to say at these domains. They are, however, part of the daily linguistic experience and communication ethos of vast populations, and we are witness of something that we could call an instinct of radical communication that expresses continuity between humans, beings, to each other, and to the world. So with this in mind, again, and in the context of a society with a high degree of sociolinguistic awareness, such as the Catalan, we launched those two events. Well, to be honest, it wasn't the background. I mean, it kind of has been articulated here. It's not probably the background of those events anyway. It was more simple. So we were placing those activities in a city where linguistic diversity has been widely celebrated over some years. Just celebrated, like in a quite naive, at times frivolous kind of, not very much reflected upon concept. Anyway, it is a society with all this curiosity about linguistic diversity, has had a proper political imagination for linguistic reciprocity, and the best known example was reciprocity between Catalan speakers and Amazigh speakers, for instance. So just helping speakers of minority languages in other contexts to raise their self-esteem, so to be speaking, about their claiming the power of their language in contexts where they were suppressed, such as Amazigh in Arabophone countries in North Africa, etc. So on the other hand, a lot of language policy expertise has been exported over the years to other regions of the planet, especially to Latin American countries, precisely. This has entailed more often than not the exportation of the Catalan linguistic ideology with all its corresponding administrative paraphernalia. So the aim of the actions was to show to what extent linguistic diversity does not just include a variety of codes, languages, but plurality of ways of conceiving of and experiencing communication. So as far as the further, we do have this residency of artists dealing with verbal arts. It was in November 2018. It was a residency of artists where we made converge activists in the defense of cultural and linguistic diversity from the colonial perspective, with all the caveats to diversity and the colonial as we wish. So revitalization and indigenous agents who rethink their own kind of cultural heritage. They were researchers of linguistic anthropology in related fields, and also verbal art creators or researchers. Through the different experiences, it was expressed how the actual life of language has little to do with the schematic instrumental view rendered by mainstream linguistics. The artificiality of language is rendered just as instruments. Okay. So in this case, had the example of Heinerianes, Maya anthropologists referred to examples of Maya song, which for the most part were documented with no context, in isolation from other modes of communication like gesture, movement, dance, or other forms of embodied performance. So it was just one of those cases where probably the continuity between music and language, singing and speaking, was with José Antonio Flores, probably very well known of you. And we also had examples of sad stories of Australia and completely miscalculated time. So as for the meeting about language and spiritual traditions, the first thing that I wanted to say, it's like spiritual again is one of those terms that are very much connotated by, as it's very well put it here by Joaquin Cabral in this article. Well, he highlights the fact that by some kind of a classical anthropologist, as you can see, the matter of transcendence was mostly approached in terms of religion, belief in spirits, but it became apparent that such formulations were just trying to universalize individualist ontology and the Christian notion of spirituality. So rather than that's what is interesting in our approach to that, to the connection between language and spirituality, is that it's actually a connection between language and the construct of the person. Because some form of transcendence was more generally a condition of being a person, and beliefs in what Europeans might be tempted to call souls or spirits were a function of the process of constitution of the person. So that this, as Lenin says, to be, to exist is to participate. So I think also nicely connects to with all this small seeds of debate about voice that we have been having here, about who is inside of as Carla said, like the empowerment was not individual, was of the community. So who's speaking, who's like, so it's again this kind of person that is including more than one individual, of course. So just very briefly, so that was some of the, we had this gathering of the classical round table of different religious communities, and our participants came with all their attributes of religious, like the kippah, or the cover for the Sikhs, etc. So we had this kind of misleading round table of people representing different linguistic traditions, but we weren't there to speak about religious diversity in the city. We were there to speak about how they, from their spiritual practice, were constructing the use of their linguistic technologies. So we were just on a cross-cutting kind of approach, trying to elicit some reactions or comments on these sort of questions. Yeah? So how the use of the voice. The difference, actually, this is a concept of Robbins in his articles, the difference between the semiotics of speaking and the semiotics of listening, which is also something that at some group we're not very aware of too. And well, so it was like realizing that we were coexisting with all this variety of linguistic ideologies, disguised in religious diversity. So it's something like, okay, it's a part of peripheral, it's something that is not relevant for mainstream society. So, yes, I was saying this kind of misleading roundtable of participants, so we weren't talking about interreligious dialogue, would be the case, but it wasn't our goal. So, yes, I'm not really sure how well that objective was understood, let alone fulfilled. We had an unexpected good turnout, though, probably motivated by the growing appeal of everything spiritual, and whatever the term evolves to everyone. And yes, so yeah, I had just some brief notes about the second edition, but probably we can leave it here. Just the last sentence, that the aim of the overall initiative was to present the continuity of categories such as the ordinary, the poetic, and the sacred, and instead of leaving them like conceived as binary distinctions, ordinary, normal, sacred, profane, poetic, ordinary, we wanted to show how they belong to a continuum and how they encapsulate ideas of actually how we conceive and experience language and the person. And that's all. Thank you very much.
Okay, coming down to the final stretch, and I'll try to stay within time. Denise and I kind of have paired presentations. In 2016, well, a couple of years ago, in a moment of weakness, I agreed to contribute a chapter to a special issue of a journal. The special issue was entitled Cross-Cultural Studies in Well-Being. So my assignment was to write a chapter on the concept of well-being in the Andes. Almost immediately, I started to have second thoughts. Oh no, who am I talking about? Is there a concept of well-being that one can generalize across such a culturally and socially diverse and rapidly changing landscape? So finally, I just decided to narrow my focus, concentrate on the rural highland community in southern Peru that I know firsthand, but trying to emphasize values that are generally consistent across the ethnographic and ethnohistorical record. Now, in my experience, the Quechua term that most closely approximates English well-being is Alyin Kausai. I heard this phrase often while doing ethnographic research in the Andean highlands in Peru. Roughly, Alyin means good or well, and Kausai, broadly translated, means to live. And we've encountered Alyi already in the Alyi Shunguyuk, child, the good-hearted, intelligent, well-spoken, upright child. Now, for example, with Alyin Kausai, When my friend Luis Gutierrez showed me how to share coca leaves with animate places in the landscape, he commented, "Hinaruanchi Zalyin Kausayin Chispak. We do this for our well-being, and kindly including the inclusive." Since the early 2000s, and this I could not ignore when writing this paper, to my sorrow, similar phrases have entered the political discourse of Andean nations. Sumac Kausai in Ecuadorian Quechua, and Suma Camana in Bolivian Aymara, translated respectively as buen vivir and vivir bien, living well, well-being. Both phrases serve as rallying points for left-of-center networks united in a critique of neoliberalism. Ecuador and Bolivia have enshrined the phrases as central tenets of their national constitutions. And the virtual absence of this discourse in Peru is striking. And I don't quite understand it, and probably Rosalind has some insights into this. Aspirations for Kausai, without an adjective, do pepper the discourse of a few fairly obscure NGOs, but I was struck by its lack on the national, sort of a national level. In 2008, the new Ecuadorian constitution framed Sumac Kausai, or buen vivir, as a set of rights, celebrating nature, the Pachamama, of which we are part and which is vital to our existence. We've determined to construct a new form of civic collective life in diversity and harmony with nature to attain well-being. Sumac Kausai. We recognize that, and this comes up a little later, we recognize that the population has a right to live in a healthy and ecologically balanced environment that guarantees sustainability and a good life. Sumac Kausai. So, not surprised, Sumac Camana, along with other Aymara and Quechua and Guarani phrases, provides a moral framework for the 2009 Bolivian Constitution, and I believe Denise is going to talk more about Bolivia, so I'm going to leave that aside. Not surprisingly, academics are beginning to respond to these remarkable constitutional developments with a growing literature. This guy actually counted them up. As I renewed my literature search in preparation for this conference, I was hit by a virtual tsunami of publications. Oh my God, no. Most of them are written from an alternate development perspective, and relatively few look critically at the way indigenous terms are being used to promote non-indigenous interests. My original paper pointed to a kind of semantic slippage that occurs as Alyin Kausai is transformed into Sumac Kausai / buen vivir. I interpreted this slippage in terms of Viveros de Castro's concept of equivocation, that is, which we heard about this morning. It's a communicative disjuncture that occurs when parties try to understand each other, using terms that overlap but are not equivalent. And so in this paper, I'm going to examine this disjunction more closely. And from the outset, I have to confess that I come from a position of naivete. I don't have firsthand experience of either the Ecuadorian or Bolivian contexts, and I'm not a linguist. In 1975, I undertook a year of field research in Sonco, a Quechua-speaking community northeast of the city of Cusco in southern Peru. I've returned 10 times over the years, including a brief visit this past July. Sonko is an IOU which I provisionally define as an indigenous community holding land in common and united by ties of mutual aid, because it's undergone many significant changes over the years, a discussion of which I've left out in the interest of time. But I should mention that my ethnographic present reflects my most intense periods of field work in the 70s and 80s, before the decade of turmoil and economic collapse caused by the Sendero Luminoso guerrilla movement. Peru's Mapa de la Pobreza poverty map charts the distribution of wealth across Peru's territory and locates Sonko in a zone of extrema pobreza, that is extreme poverty. Until my return to Cusco this past July, I thought this condition might explain why I never heard the term sumac kausai, because sumac is a superlative, excellent, gorgeous, delicious, fine. I thought that for people living in extreme poverty, aspiring to sumac kausai, the wonderful life, would be a bit over the top, while awiyin kausai, the good life in the sense of whole and healthy, would be a more realistic aspiration. My limited inquiries last July revealed that I was mistaken. Poor or not, my interlocutors rejected sumac kausai because it doesn't really make sense. As a bilingual and comfortably well-off friend in Cusco told me, we don't use the term. It seems that sumac, and this isn't the result of a real linguistic study, this is my understanding now. Sumac applies concretely to a discrete person or such a situation, while the appropriate modifier for a state of being like kausai, or life as a whole, is awiyin, which means good in the sense of morally upright, healthy, and whole. One wishes to have adequate subsistence, good health, and especially to live with others in an atmosphere of peace and mutual respect. Awiyin kausai is a moral, not a material condition. That was really emphasized to me this past July. And it exists, and this is significant in terms of some other things I'm about to talk about. It was explained to me that awiyin kausai exists in different levels, each of which is nested in others. And so you have awiyin kausai at your personal level, your household level, the community level, the intercommunity level. Then they kind of stop. The national level, international, you'll never have awiyin kausai. So in the interest of time, I touch only briefly on key terms in Southern Peruvian Quechua that shed light on understandings of what life is and what it means to live well, bearing in mind that these are approximate translations across radically different linguistic and cultural frames of reference. When we ask where agency is located, that's a question that came up this morning in our language. There's an interesting article in Press by Bruce Mannheim where he contrasts, on the basis of some experimental work with a cognitive psychologist, Susan Gelman, he argues that the egocentric system of English and Spanish, for example, project a frame of reference from the vantage of the speaker, whereas in Quechua, at least among monolingual speakers, the allocentric frame of reference is anchored in the physical space surrounding the interaction rather than in the participants. Thus, quote, Quechua grammar and social practices presuppose and implicate forms of social agency that attribute agentive powers to places and to other objects, things we would consider inanimate, end quote. Trying to communicate across ontological divides inevitably confronts us with that communicative disjuncture that is equivocation, Not my favorite word, but that's what we use. Viveros de Castro says, to translate is to situate oneself in the space of equivocation and to dwell there. It is to communicate by differences. Equivocation immediately comes to the fore in a way I don't really need these slides, it's a sort of atmosphere. Equivocation immediately comes to the fore when we consider the verb kausai. In its most obvious sense, kausai refers to the state of being alive rather than being dead. As in the question, Mamaiki kausan rakchu, is your mother still alive? Yet as conversation proceeds, one learns that even the bones of the dead retain certain kinds of agency and are sometimes referred to as being alive. Although degrees of liveliness and agency vary, nothing is absolutely inanimate. Every feature in the landscape has a personhood that must be respected, as do domestic animals and artifacts like hand-woven textiles. These are the relationships one nurtures, as Louise said, Alien Kausainin Chispa, for our well-being. And in terms of philosophies of the relationship to notions of language, Regina Harrison, in her book, Sign, Songs, and Memory, that came out in the 80s, she reports that when she was learning Quechua from a teacher in an Amazonian community, which I forget exactly which one it was, she would overhear people asking her teacher, Kausan Rakchu, is she alive yet? And asking whether she had learned the language sufficiently to be part of the community. In nominal form, kausai refers to the whole material context in which one subsists, as in English, earning a living. When I took Luis to visit the Inca Museum in Cusco, he described the exhibits as containing Inca kausai, Inca living, and he emerged disturbed and depressed as if he had been visiting a prison. Consistent with an allocentric frame of reference, this ontological orientation prioritizes relationships over individual agencies. The self emerges not so much a unitary being as a node in the web of active relationships among all beings, including non-human beings like mountains. Note that there's no room here for a concept, oh my goodness, a concept like nature. Pacha is another term that's made it into the Ecuadorian constitution. In its broadest sense, it means world, sometimes translated as space-time. It is characterized by a fluidity of scale. It can refer to the whole cosmos or an instantaneous located event. It has this nested quality. Every moment is nested within other moments and places within places. And while objectively material, it's a state of consciousness. It's a convergence of sensible entities that compose it. It's a material, lived-in moment. And I will just speed over these other things. So IOU, the community, IOUs are nested within other IOUs. And IOUs composed not just of human beings, but of all the entities in the place. They're all imbued with the water of the place, and it's through that water of the place that they speak the language. Social life within an IOU circulates through mutual aid, through reciprocal appropriations of energy and skill, the most basic of which is irony. One party always owes the other. The social scale is perpetually unbalanced. And so it's not accurate to talk really about balance and harmony so much as, because there is no steady state, but well-being consists in the wherewithal to keep writing in balance, to keep, that every moment is dynamically unbalanced. You have to try to push it the other way so that you can think of a sort of teeter-tottering. Now turning to sumac calci, I just have a few minutes. Sumac calci appears 7 times in Ecuador's constitution, and Pachamama as a synonym for nature appears twice. The rights of nature and the duties of the government to protect them is a theme that runs through the government, or through the document. 10 years on, although the rights of nature are pretty much honored in the breach, Buen Vivir, sumac calci, has garnered great interest, as I said, among academics and activists engaged in critiquing mainstream development policies. Most of these papers trace back the use of the word sumac calci to a short paper published in 2002 by Carlos Viteri, who's a Quechua-speaking Sarayaku activist and politician, has training in anthropology. And interestingly, so I, chased down this essay, and what does he concentrate on? Algae calci. It says in the introduction, he kind of tacks sumac calci onto the end of a sentence. But then he goes on and he talks about algae calci. His paper's a very critical paper arguing that the concepts of that development projects introduce the concept of poverty as a kind of colonialization. He says the introduction of the concept of development gradually annihilates the people's own philosophy of alien calci. Nowhere in his discussion of algae calci does he use the word naturaleza or nature. Rather, he writes of ethical and spiritual conduct in relation to the surroundings. He notes that various forms of life are conceived as analogous of persons with whom man is destined to live in the context of permanent dialogue. Now, by 2008, this position had been reformulated in the Constitution as sumac calci. Pacha was elided with nature, even though the two are ontologically incommensurable concepts. And moreover, Pacha has turned into Pachamama, evoking Mother Nature, a folkloric metaphor, with little similarity to Pachamama as she's invoked in an IU. So here indeed is equivocation. Why did algae calci give way to sumac calci? I haven't been able to retrace the process through which this slippage came apart. A few scholarly voices have raised objections. For example, Ecuadorian scholar, I think now living in Spain, named Javier Cuestas Casa, in a paper entitled Sumac calci is not Buen Vivir, demonstrates that in Imbabura Quechua, a better synonym for Buen Vivir is, guess what, algae calci. And he describes algae calci in terms, it just could be the same terms that I heard in Cusco. And he comments the incorrect synonymy present in many academic texts could be interpreted as a subtle form of epistemic neo-colonization through the sophisticated use of language which speaks by or over the Andean populations, but with Western glasses. This Western gaze embraces sumac calci as a Native American concept opposed to Western notions of progress and unfettered material growth. Sumac Kausai even has its own Wikipedia page. And I suspect that it caught on, Sumac caught on, partly because if you don't know any Quechua at all, you've probably heard of Ima Sumac. And so that will be probably the one word of Quechua that people know, and it also resonates nicely with Latin-based superlatives like summa cum laude, summamente, summit. Alain is unfamiliar, and at least for many English speakers, hard to pronounce. While sumac is easy to say, well, it just sounds like a Native American phrase. So it must be
There's also
good.
a spice that we use in our cooking called sumac, which has got nothing to do with Quechua, but it's out there.
Yeah, it's a familiar, familiar sound. Cuestas Casa observes that the Sumac Kausai discourse now flows now from the top down, even into communities that never used it. In Imbabura, he comments, Sumac Kausai is recognized as a recreated tradition, a kind of utopia, and although it is a recent term in their vocabulary, they have begun to appropriate it. And just, oh, yeah, this is one of them. I have to show you this. So this is from 2012, and a NGO called Amazon Watch published this statement by Jose Gualinga, the president of the Sariaku community, thanking friends and allies of Sariaku for support in the struggle against oil exploration in the territory. You can see what he says. We are defenders of life and human rights, guardians of Mother Nature, eternal protectors of Kausak Sacha, the living jungle. By the way, Eduardo Cohn was part of the event in which he made this statement. Protectors of the living jungle, watchers of the planetary balance, and a force behind a new paradigm of economic development that contributes to Sumac Kausai. He can talk the talk. So what a contrast with Viteri's programmatic statement written a decade earlier. And I'll skip over this part. This is a discussion by a couple of Spanish sociologists deconstructing Wayne Vivier's A School of Thought, and this is all of their, what they say, all of the different sources that have fed into it, which they sort into three baskets: indigenous, the ecologist, post-development, and the politically dominant socialist statist. Yes. They comment that the phrase was empty, which they and thus each approach could fill it as they saw fit. They said that this was because indigenous ways had died out, so everybody could fill up these indigenous words as they wanted. I would say it's not so much. I agree that the phrase it was treated as an empty phrase, but it wouldn't. It was really due to this ontological incompatibility that rendered their content, in a sense, invisible. So, to wind up, translation is always subject to equivocation, and translating across different frames of reference is obviously problematic. The resulting inexactitude renders the translated phrases conveniently vague and subject to different ranges of interpretation. And to conclude, Sumac Kausai provides a good example of the kind of colonizing discourse critiqued by Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui. Cuestas Casa independently offers a similar critique. He insists that we recognize the inherent inexactitude of translation, and that this recognition is itself of a kind of resistance to an epistemic globalization, resistance that starts with the recognition of the alterities that are not or do not want to be part of Western hegemonic discourse. Or to use Viveros de Castro's terms, we need to dwell in that space of equivocation. Thank you.
So Denise Arnold is going to talk to us the kind of companion paper to this one. The Bolivian invention of BBN, really well, as an indigenous concept in Aymara expressed as sumac amanya or sumac calcite, etc. Denise is from the Instituto de Lengua y Cultura Aymara.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you to Rosalind for the invitation, and my compliments. Kit is doing quite well, although I'm looking just at Bolivia. The government of Evo Morales and the mass party Movimiento al Socialismo in Bolivia is well known at an international level for its posture of respect towards indigenous people and for its official support of the philosophy of living well, vivir bien, sumac amanya, sumac causa. However, we had a very small project with a group of students who wanted to film the political use of indigenous concepts like sumac amanya in Bolivia, and so we did a series of filmed interviews, and oh, sorry, it's very odd, jumping slide. With these people to try and get what was at the heart of the matter and how the term had evolved over time. There's a whole regional interest in the concept of living well, vivir bien. It's a key idea in ethics and the philosophy of life, as Kitty has said, and some kind of alternative civilizational horizon to patterns of conventional development. And the justification is always that it has to do with indigenous people, but what if that's not the case? Some arguments already say that it's an appropriation of the indigenous and that living well becomes an empty discourse. And I'm not citing right-wing think tanks, but so they're probably in the same paper that Kitty mentioned. Other studies on the apparent slippage between concepts and practices associated with them call our attention to the link between such definitions of culture and a tendency to indigenize culture, but always as a concept relegated to the peripheries and the people on the peripheries. And it seemed to us that the whole notion of vivir bien, with its supposed nexus to indigenous peoples, fell in this categorical trap with its formulations in networks already saturated with power. So how could we de-universalize and de-anthropologize these concepts while thinking about what this pursuit of happiness might mean for indigenous peoples? I'm not against debating or taking advantage of political ideas such as vivir bien, but there are in Bolivia very dogmatic, politicized ways of doing this. And so, you come to see all the inconsistencies between this notion that there's in Latin America, particularly in the Andes, a general human desire to live well in a kind of public happiness, and secondly, that the concept has to do with indigenous people. So, looking at the linguistic meanings as they came out to us from these interviews, many Aymara speakers that we spoke to didn't know what sumac amanya meant at all. There are various jokes about kind of associated terms, but very few of them did at a very personal level, and this suggested that the expressions were limited to certain regions and particular contexts. For example, the Bolivian ex-chancellor of the plurinational state, Fernando Bonacuni, had heard the expression as a small child, with his grandmother telling him how to behave well as a proper person, saying "Suma kamanya taki, wawa lula suma hakanya taki." Another Aymara intellectual, Simon Yampara, is one of the key figures in thinking about and disseminating the whole concept of Bidi of Bien. But when we interviewed him here, he again said it wasn't a general concept at all in his birthplace, which is Ayu Hachichambi in Curuara de Pacajes in the Bolivian Altiplano. It was very particular in a rite of consecration of the couple in marriage, when the pair are introduced to the son's first rays as a couple, and when they participate in a family banquet that same day. They have a great feast, there's a series of libations, a round of cocoa chewing, and then the older people begin to give these sayings, ehwa, advice to them. Wawanakar suma kamanya sibhata, children, you shall live well. So again, it's very particular. He develops this idea into Aymara cultural capital. I interviewed Juan de Dios Yapita. And he, in contrast to these two former speakers, wasn't familiar with the expression in family context, and he thought that it was highly forced and appears really recently as a kind of project for the future financed by outsiders, like the idea of well-being in general. And we hadn't heard the expression, apart from this jokey idea of it, in the Ayuso of Oruro or North of Potosi either. Juan de Dios's way of saying something like living well would be suma hakanya and not suma kamanya. And he points out that the verb kamanya means to stay somewhere, but a very short period of time. So it's kind of said as a joke that it's like being a politician in the mass party, that you will have total power and lots of money, but for a very short period of time. So it would be suma kamanya. You might say to someone, Karus kamata, how many days will you be there, like in a hotel visit or something like this, but it's a very short period of time. Alison Spedding, here, an English anthropologist and speaker of Yungenyu Aymara, had her own experience of the term in the Yungas of La Paz, which is closer to Juan's experience. She says, Kamanya, at least in everyday Aymara, means to stay at home. It's not a very positive concept. You'd say it of a woman in her last weeks of pregnancy, or a very old woman who's blind and can't move about much, and so has to stay at home. And you'd use it in terms of compassion or pity, or else with contempt. In the case of ikamiri, which comes from the verb kamanya, meaning someone who is wealthy, but it's someone who stays at home because they are wealthy and have other people to work for them. So again, it's said with a term of contempt. Rosalind Bold, another English anthropologist, had a particular project to work on a study from the year 2012 about the government agency UDAPE, who'd worked with 21 communities in 14 language groups in the whole country, trying to find meanings of the concept suma kamanya and suma kausai, and they couldn't find any. And when it came to writing up their final report, they just resorted to the National Development Plan and the new political constitution. So her argument is it's an idea of urban intellectuals, and then it goes out into the rural areas through these political meetings. Raul Rodriguez here, a Bolivian anthropologist, had the same experience in the south of Oruro, in Pampa Aullagas, and with the Chipaya people, even the elder people who'd worked with CONAMAC, the National Indigenous Organization, thought it was something brought to the region by NGOs. They were using it in indigenous autonomous programs or proposals with finance from international cooperation. They didn't know the meaning of it. Even so, we shouldn't ignore how it's become so well known. It seems to be from these family contexts like Simon Yamparas and Guanacunes that they have developed this idea of a campesina moral economy, a kind of deontic juridical system, developing this idea of summa kamanya from local knowledge right up into this wider outside sphere, and it becomes a kind of reappropriation of modernist discourse in the process that Marshall Salins has called the indigenization of modernity. So it's here that you find a kind of hybrid marriage between a more Aymara concept from certain regions and the processes of modernity initially imposed from outside. In the transition of the concept of summa kamanya in Bolivia, we see this flow between a family context and public life in what we identified as three conjunctures. One was quite a long time ago. It was in 1992 with the quincentenario, the 500-year celebration of the Spanish conquest by the Spanish and the Europeans, as against how indigenous people could rethink this and throw it in the faces of the Europeans at these particular meetings in the ruins of Tiwanaku. So it was a very ritualized process. But even so, Javier Albo, who we'd interviewed, said that even before then, in 1991, in Radio Aclo, a Jesuit radio station in several departments in Bolivia, had wanted to celebrate their own 25 years of Jesuit education and looked for this term that captured it, and it was alien causa. So they translated this into Spanish as Vivir Bien, and then the actors, the indigenous leaders, in the ruins of Tiwanaku, put it into a public sphere in this contestation towards the Spanish, and then Guanacuni, as one of these actors, goes off to the site of Teotihuacan, Mexico, then on to Ecuador and elsewhere, and then it goes up into this public level. The second conjuncture, still in the 1990s, and which Kitty mentioned, is this emerging consciousness at a world level about the climate crisis, the Anthropocene, and how to mitigate its tendencies. And Vivir Bien becomes transformed into an alternative proposal to the development model that's been in vogue since the Second World War. And so it jumps up again into this wider public sphere. And it's very interesting that there are key international organisms, such as from Germany, that were very interested in mapping the lowlands and their resources in Bolivia, and they saw ways that this could become an alternative form of development to the extractionism of the day. And so they put money behind it. Another Bolivian intellectual, Javier Medina, used the expression. He joined the German technical cooperation group, GTZ, and he called his section of work Summa Camania. And then he worked with the Fundación Jubileo, which is part of the Catholic Church, to develop all this critique of the World Bank, and with Vivir Bien as a horizontal axis. The third conjuncture comes, as Kitty's mentioned. It goes then into the Ecuadorian Constitution in 2008 and into the Bolivian Constitution in 2009, although it's been very difficult to get anywhere with it because the Constitution says one thing and now we have a government very intent on extractionism and so on. And so the Mass Party has this posture of going along with this discursive level of the concept, always tied to indigenous peoples, but not doing very much on the ground. It's also interesting that the German influence in this, which Javier Medina told us about, was that the concept and all of this arose in the lowlands with indigenous leaders trained by organizations like CIDOB in the lowlands, and it was only much, much later applied to the highlands, where indigenous leadership was still very much in its beginnings. There are many other limitations to the current concept of Vivir Bien. We had our own critiques. It's antagonistic, and that is seen in its origins from 1991, 1992. It's always opposing us against them, the Spanish and Europeans in general. And that's the way that the Mass Party and the Bolivian government have used this concept. Guanacuni and Yampara, though, don't go along with that. They have much more interest in the cosmological and ecological context of the term, and not so much its divisory aspects. There are instrumental uses of Vivir Bien with this tendency towards divisionism, and there's a particularly anthropomorphic, Kitty passed on this patronymic, as they say, view of nature outside of us, and the indigenous as the people who will save the planet in the face of the Anthropocene. There are these endless binary postures, culture, nature, society, nature, in Cartesian dualisms, and you just get trapped in these dualisms in the debates about Vivir Bien in Bolivia, and as people like Gabriel Tad or Charles Pearce have mentioned, even we see it with Brexit here, you know, if you've got two polar opposites, you just keep flipping between them and you don't get this resolution. The current concepts of Vivir Bien are not being included well in ideas in Bolivia about how to rethink the Anthropocene, looking at people like Donna Haraway, Isabel Stengers, Viveros, and others, Bruno Latour. It's going into the universities in the last few years, but it seems a shame that, you know, in Bolivia we can't develop indigenous concepts like uiwaño, uiwasiña to real mutually, which really are having a field day in anthropology and archaeology of the Andes as something that really touches the livelihoods of indigenous people of the continent, as opposed to this invented concept. It's a dominant slogan to embrace all alternatives. You've got this nostalgic idea to the pre-conquest period and an equally imagined vision of the West. You've got these Manichaean dualities which go on, and it hides a range of positionings on both sides of the debate. Even on the Western side, we've had the experience of the welfare state from 48 onwards in the UK, read Vivir Bien. Many documents in the 90s, bank documents, use this term and translate them immediately as Vivir Bien. So I claim that Nair and Bevan had a say in the foundation of the term as well. And the Bolivians, like Elizabeth Peredo and Pedro Solon at the Solon Foundation in their book Alternativas Sistémicas, keep insisting that Vivir Bien forms alliances with other tendencies in order to expand the range of influence it can have instead of just having this very limited debate. Another more serious problem, and I've finished round it off here, is that thinking around Vivir Bien is it becomes a nominal phrase, static and limited to instances such as Summa Camagna and its equivalents with their superficiality and fleeting nature instead of capturing the dynamics of the world in which we live. So there are philosophical aspects here, and it leads us away from what's authentically Andean and indigenous. I've been reading, I had to teach on Andean philosophy course, and I started reading the French philosopher and sinologist François Julienne, his book Vital Nourishment, Departing from Happiness. It's a very interesting book because he compares ancient China and ancient Greece and the history of the Western philosophical tradition in ancient Greece. And there's lots of things of the Andes that come in his Chinese part of this equation. And he insists that this constant search for happiness as the goal of life derives from the Western philosophical tradition. He gives us all these sayings of Aristotle and so on, and this way that at a certain point in time, Aristotle explores ends and purposes of action, whether of contemplation or reasoning, directed towards happiness and felicity as the be-all and end-all, the most desirous values of existence. As Julienne clarifies, this idea of finality did not exist for the ancient Chinese, who were not at all worried about pursuing happiness. They sought rather the full potential of a situation, or how to transform a situation for the benefit of their own group or against the interests of an enemy. He puts this down to the fact that in ancient Greece, there is the introduction of the verb to be, and hence the cultural development of the active subject in the world. It's dangerous to say something like this, so deterministic, among a group of linguists. But Aymara and Quechua don't have verbs to be. There's ser and estar. There's ways that you can say these concepts, hake, person, hakeña, to be a person. But there's not a separate verbal thing. And he thinks that this is at the heart of some of our Western problems of introducing into the world the notion of an active subject who attempts to impose himself actively as an agent in the world. This whole idea of agency of change is not a part of those other traditions. And I must say this rings very true for me from having lived in those cultures for a number of years and tried to understand them. By comparison, there's this idea that there's a recognition that life passes temporarily through us when the challenge is how to be conscious of life's rhythms and how to house them in ourselves. And it's this fundamental difference that clarifies for me the ambiguous nature of the proposals in all the debates around concepts like Vivir Bien and their political usages. So I'll stop there just to wrap up.
Thank you very much. Wow,
talked about how the agrarian reform in Peru in 1969, which took indigenous communities to being peasant communities, comunidades campesinas, and then invisibilized indigenous ethnicity, and then subsequently can help explain the lack of an ethnically mobilized political movement in Peru. I wondered if it might be relevant for...
Well, yes, and actually I did mention that when I skipped. But I'm not positive of that, but I think there is something to that the agrarian reform redefined indios as campesinos and de-emphasized this indigenous aspect. But it seems to me that there was already a difference in the presence of indigenous, the word indigenous is problematic, but what we call indigenous activism in Peru. I think the fact that the agrarian reform could have that effect was because there was already a kind of sort of more atomized and community-based sense of identity, and people were ready to give up being Indios and being campesinos. So yes, on one hand I agree with her, but I don't think the agrarian reform is the whole story.
Georgia and then Barbara.
So this is kind of following up on that, because I've also been wondering, since we talked earlier in your paper about why not Peru, why Ecuador and Bolivia. And from hearing your paper as well, it seems that, in my experiences in Ecuador, it seems that there's really a developmentalist agenda behind the inclusion of Buen Vivir and Sumak Kawsay in the national discourse. So in Ecuador in particular, Sumak Kawsay has really been used to authorize very not Sumak Kawsay or Ali Kawsay sort of practices, so around extractivism, right? So all of the socialist projects that went on in Ecuador were actually very neoliberal projects. Right. And it seems that that might be the case, but that Peru might not be doing that same sort of developmentalist project around indigenous communities in particular.
No, I mean, they've got certainly the developmentalist, resource extraction and all. That's going on full blast.
Yeah, it seems like they're trying to hide it elsewhere.
But
like
but it doesn't get dressed up.
No.
Yeah.
They're more open about it.
Yeah.
They don't say, oh, Sumak Kawsay on the one hand, and
Right.
then, because actually, it's, as Kitty says, it's just like completely.
Yeah. Yeah, so I wondered if that was part of it.
How are we going?
There's not the same degree of indigenous posturing and rituality and so on in Peru either, is there?
No,
There has been
very
with
briefly,
Torero.
there was this President Toledo around in the early 2000s who was inaugurated in Machu Picchu and was supposedly going to be the first indigenous president. But then his presidency very rapidly kind of devolved into business as usual, and I think there was a fair amount of disillusionment around that. So that whatever discourse there was of Sumak Kawsay and so forth got kind of dropped or devalidated.
Yeah, I've done a bit of research on this topic myself, and I was digging around in some of the Peruvian official documents. There's certainly no whisper of it in the Constitution, which hasn't actually been reformed since 1993. So, but there's no whisper of it either in, as far as I can see, the legislation that I've looked at around language and education. But where I did find use of it was in documents drawn up by the Defensoria, the Ombudsman, which is a body obviously that works in favour of linguistic rights, but it's not exactly I'm not quite sure of the status of the ombudsman. I don't know if somebody can help me there. Sheila, would you happen to know? The Defensoría del Pueblo. Is it a state body?
Yes.
It's a state body. But nonetheless, they were using this term. I forget the exact, I could find the reference for you, I've got it somewhere. But there was this great document about Indigenous rights and they were using this term. And I was really surprised because I hadn't come across it anywhere else in official discourse in Peru. And to this day, I think maybe it's being used a little bit just informally because there's a sort of cross-contamination from Bolivia and Ecuador, or especially from Ecuador.
But also in Puno, more than Cusco. If you're talking with a young group of radicals, it will come up.
Yes, but then that's because of their interactions with the Bolivian Aymara, presumably. Was it with Casey?
Yeah, there might have been someone before me actually.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
So thank you so much because it's very interesting this kind of translation, the concept that is not really good translation in fact, and it remembers also Mexican cases in another Mexican language where they try to translate freedom, gender freedom, and the translation that people do was very funny because there are some kind of the cage where the chicken life, and so this was freedom. And I think that we have a really big challenge in this conception, not only to translate legal concept and that is strong for us, but also to hear how the people talk about this kind of practice, not the concept but the practice. Yes. And I found very interesting to hear in which context this kind of sumac word emerge, which are the uses, and that talk a lot about linguistic construction that I think that is not only linguistic, it's also cultural construction. And I think that we have a lot to learn about this kind of grammatical difference, cultural difference in Bolivian context, in Ecuadorian context, in Mexican context, in other contexts. Yeah.
There's no doubt that young indigenous people, young Aymara speakers, want to believe in something like that, and there are endless theses or diploma things that I have to kind of supervise where that is the theme of it, and then looking for ways of how to introduce it and how to have indicators, but it never goes up to a government level like that.
Yeah. And it's important that it starts.
I think Casey has a question.
Yeah, I wanted to, again, talking about the Buen Vivir and the Sumac Causa stuff, I wanted to thank you both for writing these papers because this has kind of been my pet peeve for a long time now. And I had an article on this topic that got rejected, which is interesting because I think there are not everyone actually takes the view you guys are on this. But it reminded me when I was reading Marisol de la Cadena's Cosmopolitics article back in the day, which I thought was so interesting, but I was so shocked that she used the example of the Ecuadorian constitution that you talk about as an example of the resurgence of indigenous concepts into national and regional politics.
Yeah.
And of course I was thinking, okay, she's not an Ecuadorianist, but because I was reading the Ecuadorian constitution like you, saying it's constantly enmeshed with ideas of nature and culture, the rights of nature, as part of a national development plan. So it's not just in the constitution, it's central to the whole citizens' revolution idea. So it was very difficult for me to take that seriously. So I'm glad to see you guys writing critically. But I've also tried to write about how, looking at this, so I think it's kind of problematic at that level, but I was trying to look at it through my field work with Waorani people, fighting oil, getting involved with environmentalism, and obviously these ideas don't map at all onto anyone working in Amazonia. Like Waorani people have an idea of their territory or land as Waome, where obviously nature and culture just cannot be pulled apart, which you'd find pretty much anywhere in these places. I do have a question about this. So I'm really glad that this work is done because I didn't want to have to do this work, like to dig up the actual history of these ideas. It's very interesting. But the question I had, and there was one other point that I wanted to make, and that is about how it isn't just that they're translating these things in problematic ways, but I think they're actually quite strategic in a lot of ways. And I actually read this, maybe it's because I come from the US, but I was reading it almost as like what you read about the history of North American Indians, where an Indian signs a piece of paper and that becomes a treaty, and then they get defined as the chief, and so people get kind of attributed through these translations that are actually quite strategic sometimes. I think there's something of that going on in the sort of misuse of these terms. But my real question was really about, okay, we can all agree that these are really problematic translations and political uses of quasi-indigenous concepts, but is there a place for indigenous concepts in these sort of arenas? Whether it's a national constitution or in these sorts of areas, do we need them? I mean, obviously, in this case, it's being put at the service of neoliberal extractive agendas, Ecuador being the best example. But can we envision more genuine or more kind of relevant categories from your guys' field work actually having a place in national politics, or is that just a irrelevant thing?
I think it's really problematic. I mean, I think that this idea of cosmopolitics is setting that up as a kind of ideal, but I think exactly because it's so hard to talk across these differences, and that the powers that be are always going to have the upper hand, and that's why Pacha gets turned into nature. So we have Sumak Kausai and nature, and Sumak Kausai being made to is a kind of an empty term or a collage that gets put together. But I think the fact that it's there, that it got into the Ecuadorian Constitution, in a way you look at it and say, oh God, this is bogus. And it is bogus, but on the other hand, the fact that it's there at all, even if it's honored in the breach, I think may indicate a kind of sea change in an overall general approach.
Even if the oil development gets expanded in the midst of the whole thing. But I see what you mean. If you compare it to the 1960s or 70s, the idea that you would mention anything positive about indigeneity at all in a document.
Yeah.
It's a part of what in Bolivia is called mistiparla. It's mestizos kind of latching on to what they think is an indigenous idea and taking it on and so on and so on. And it happens, with kind of, what's it called? Guzman de Rojas and his tripartite logic or something of Aymara. I mean, no Aymara is going to talk about that, but he became so famous, he was given funds in an office in the World Bank in Washington and so on, because it becomes this kind of concept that people latch onto. But people really in government, like Wanakuni or Simon Yampara, who had a powerful role in the municipality of El Alto, they bend over backwards not to apply it, and they say, well, we have to change the Bolivian state first, imagine, before we could even apply something like this, and that will take at least 20 years, so, they just slither and slide.
But then you said that he even, in effect, admitted that he kind of made it up.
Well, I was trying to say they didn't really make it up because they had some personal experience of it, he in his childhood and Simon Yampara in this marriage ceremony. But it was a very peripheral event. It's certainly not a part of common parlance. That's why so many people don't understand it.